I remember the sound of my stomach before I remember the sound of my own name. It wasn't a growl like people joke about. It was quieter than that, a hollow, wet echo like someone knocking from inside my body, asking if anyone was still home. The air in the room was cold enough to sting my lungs. I had wrapped my hands in an old newspaper because there was nothing else left to wrap them in. The ink smeared onto my skin, blackening my fingers, and I remember thinking strangely that at least the paper was still warm from the press. Outside, the city had gone quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not peaceful, empty. No wagons, no laughter, just the occasional cough drifting through the street like a warning shot. Somewhere down the block, a man was crying, not loudly but steadily, and as if he had been doing it for hours and simply hadn't stopped yet. The banks had closed that morning. No bells rang, no alarms screamed, just locked doors where money used to be, and men in clean coats standing very still, staring at glass like it might open if they stared hard enough. By afternoon, those same men were sitting on the curb, their backs against brick walls, their hats in their hands, like they were already begging, even if they didn't know it yet. That was the day hunger stopped being a feeling and became a law. And when I hear people today complain about empty shelves, about prices, about delays and inconveniences, I feel that same hollow knock again. Because I recognize the silence. I recognize the way people laugh a little too loudly when they're nervous. They have no idea what is coming. Before everything broke, the world felt soft. Not kind, just padded. Like a room with too much furniture. You could bump into things and not feel it right away. That's how life was before the fall. Mistakes didn't bleed immediately. Warnings sounded distant, like thunder that never quite reached the house. I was young then, not foolish. At least I didn't think so, but untested. I woke each morning to the clatter of streetcars and the smell of bread drifting from the bakery 2 blocks down. Real bread, warm, the kind that left grease on the paper and crumbs in the cuffs of your coat. Shops opened early, windows polished clean enough to reflect your face back at you. Men straightened their ties in that glass. Women checked their hats. Everyone looked forward, never down. Money moved like water. You didn't think about it because it was always there. Coins in your pocket, bills in your wallet. Credit extended with a handshake and a smile. I watched men sign papers they barely read, trusting ink more than instinct. They said things like, "The market always corrects and this time is different." I heard those phrases so often they became background noise like birdsong. I worked then, honest work, long hours that ended with tired legs and full plates. My hands smelled of oil and metal when I came home, but my stomach was never empty. I paid rent on time. I bought meat without counting coins. On Sundays, I sat in crowded rooms where people laughed too loud and argued about things that didn't matter. Baseball scores, stock tips, which neighborhood was coming up. I remember one man in particular, older than me, quieter. He didn't drink when the rest of us did. He listened more than he spoke. One night, after too much laughter and too many promises about the future, he leaned close and said, almost apologetically, that he was pulling his money out of the bank. Said he didn't like the numbers he was seeing. Said debt was piling up like dry wood. We laughed at him, not cruelly, worse than that, casually. We told him he was being dramatic. That fear made people see ghosts. Someone clapped him on the back and said, "Relax, they wouldn't let it all collapse." I remember that sentence clearly. They wouldn't let it, as if collapse needed permission. That was the lie we all lived inside. The newspapers still came every morning, thick with confidence. Headlines spoke of prosperity, of expansion, of opportunity. Even the bad news was dressed politely and tucked into the back pages where it couldn't cause discomfort. The language was careful, reassuring. No one wanted to be the one who shouted fire in a crowded room. And I didn't either. I saw small things, though. Things I ignored because ignoring them was easier. A shop that closed earlier than usual. A man I knew selling his watch. Another who stopped buying rounds and started nursing one drink all night. The signs were there, but they were quiet, and quiet things are easy to step over. People trusted systems then the way children trust floors not to give way beneath them. Banks were stone buildings with columns meant to look eternal. Money felt permanent because the buildings did. I stood inside one once, looking up at the ceiling, and thought how ridiculous it would be for something so solid to fail. That's the danger of comfort. It convinces you that weight equals strength. I see the same look today. Different clothes, different machines, same confidence. People assume complexity means stability. That because something is big, it must be safe. They laugh at caution. They call it pessimism. They confuse preparation with panic. Back then, we were rich in things we didn't even notice. Trust, routine, predictability. We wasted them because they felt infinite. I didn't stock food. I didn't learn skills beyond my job. I didn't build quiet redundancies into my life. I spent what I earned because tomorrow looked exactly like today, and today was easy enough. When the ground finally shifted, it didn't feel like an earthquake. It felt like embarrassment, the kind that creeps in when a joke falls flat and no one laughs. When conversations stall, when eyes avoid one another. Yes, that's how the end began. Not with screams, but with awkward silences and forced smiles. And by the time we understood that trust itself was the thing in short supply, it was already gone. That was before hunger, before cold, before the long nights when time stopped moving forward and only circled. That was when we still believed the world was sturdy. It wasn't. And neither were we. The first thing that changed was the sound. Mornings used to arrive with motion, wagons rattling over stone, doors slamming, voices calling out prices and greetings. Then, one morning, I stepped outside and the street felt muffled, as if the city had pulled a blanket over its head. People were still there, but they moved differently, slower, careful, like every step needed permission. I walked toward the bank out of habit more than need. My pay had come in 2 days earlier, and the money was still warm in my pocket, folded neat and confident. The building stood the same as always, stone, columns, brass handles polished to a dull shine. But something was wrong. Too many people, not a line, a cluster. Men in good coats standing too close to one another, not speaking. Hats still on indoors. No jokes, no impatience. The doors were locked. Now, at first, no one said anything. We just stared. There's a moment like that when the mind refuses to move forward, when it insists this must be temporary, a mistake that will correct itself if you wait long enough. Someone tried the handle again, harder this time. Another knocked. A clerk appeared briefly behind the glass, his face pale, eyes darting like he was trapped. Then the murmurs started, low, careful. Words passed from mouth to mouth, changing shape as they traveled. Temporary, technical, just today. Each one thinner than the last. By noon, the murmurs had turned sharp. I watched a man I recognized, always well-dressed, always confident, slam his fist against the door until his knuckles split. He didn't seem to notice the blood. He kept shouting numbers, as if saying them out loud would summon them back into existence. Others joined in, not with anger at first, but with desperation, pleading with the building itself, with the idea of order. By Friday, there were more locked doors. Shops didn't close all at once. That would have been too obvious. They shortened hours. Then they stopped restocking certain items. Then they put up signs written in a hurry, letters uneven, explaining delays and shortages that didn't have names yet. Meat became scarce before bread did. Coffee disappeared like it had been a rumor. Prices crept upward quietly, like they hoped not to be noticed. Paydays stopped coming. Factories sent men home for a few days. Offices told workers to wait. Everyone was waiting. Waiting became a full-time occupation. Men gathered on corners the way they used to gather inside, sharing scraps of information like currency. Who was still open? Or who had closed? Who might reopen next week? I learned quickly that next week was a lie we told ourselves to stay upright. The newspapers changed their tone, but not their words. They used softer language for harder truths. Correction, adjustment, reorganization. But I could see through it by watching faces instead of print, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning rooms. People counting coins openly now, no longer ashamed of needing to. One afternoon, I passed the same bank again. This time, men in those expensive suits were sitting on the sidewalk, backs against stone, staring at nothing. Dust clung to the fabric like it belonged there. A few held papers in their hands, folded and unfolded so many times they were nearly pulp. Proof of something that no longer mattered. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear yet. It was disbelief, a stubborn refusal to accept that a thing I had trusted without question could simply stop working. Like discovering gravity had taken the day off. At home, I started counting, not just money, food, matches, days. I told myself it was temporary. Everyone did. That word bought us time we didn't actually have. Neighbors still spoke kindly to one another, but conversations shortened. Doors closed quicker, laughter became rare, and when it appeared, it sounded forced, like someone whistling in a dark room to pretend they weren't alone. I tried to withdraw my savings from another bank. The line wrapped around the building, slow and restless. By the time I reached the front, a man stepped out and announced they were closing early. Not for the day, for the foreseeable future. He didn't explain what that meant, and no one asked. We were beginning to understand that explanations were thin ice. That night, I lay awake, listening to the city breathe, or struggle to. Sirens in the distance, a baby crying somewhere too long. The soft argument of a couple through thin walls, voices sharp with fear they didn't know how to name yet. That was when I realized the air itself had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that breathing felt different. Like the world had shifted a few inches off balance, and everything that followed would slide slowly, inevitably, in the same direction. I see that moment again when I look around today. The locked doors explained away, the delays brushed off, the faith that things will reopen, resume, recover, because they always have before. We thought the crash would announce itself. It didn't. It arrived quietly, wearing the clothes of inconvenience, and once it was inside, it never left the same way it came. Money didn't vanish in a single moment. It thinned. At first, it was still there in my pocket, folded the same way it always had been. The paper felt no different between my fingers. The ink hadn't faded. But when I tried to use it, people hesitated. A pause, a glance toward the back room, a quiet conversation that stopped when I looked up. I remember standing at a counter with a few bills laid out neatly, waiting for bread. The man behind the counter didn't reach for them right away. He stared at the money as if it were a question he didn't know how to answer. Finally, he pushed it back toward me and said, softly, that he was only taking exact change. Coins. No bills. Tomorrow, maybe nothing at all. That was the day I understood something had broken that couldn't be repaired with confidence alone. Banks still existed in name, but not in function. The buildings were there, but the promise inside them had evaporated. Savings became stories people told each other, starting with "I used to have" and ending in silence. Paper statements meant nothing. Ledgers were ghosts. Numbers on pages couldn't be eaten, burned, or traded for warmth. I watched people try to negotiate with reality. A man offered a stack of bills for a sack of potatoes. The farmer shook his head. Another tried to buy coal with a signed note from his employer. The coal dealer laughed, not kindly. Trust had collapsed faster than currency. Everyone wanted something solid, something they could touch, store, protect. Barter crept in the way rot does, quiet, inevitable. A watch for flour, shoes for firewood. Skills began to matter more than titles. I traded a repaired hinge for a meal once, on my hands working while my mind raced with the shame of it. I told myself it was temporary, a bridge to normalcy. Normal never came back the way we expected. I stopped thinking in terms of weeks. I started thinking in terms of meals. Rent stopped being a transaction and became a negotiation. Landlords, who had once been distant and formal, now knocked on doors themselves, hats in hand, eyes tired. Some were angry, some were scared. A few pretended nothing had changed, sending notices that might as well have been prayers. When eviction came, it came suddenly. Furniture on sidewalks. Mattresses leaned against lampposts like exhausted bodies. Families standing beside their lives, reduced to piles of wood and fabric, unsure where to move next. The street became a warehouse for loss. What I learned quickly, that money was only valuable when everyone agreed it was. Once that agreement fractured, it was just paper, flammable, terrible, insulting in its uselessness. I burned a bill once to light a stove. It smelled different than wood, sharper. I watched it curl and blacken and thought about how many hours of my life it represented, turning to smoke in seconds. People began hiding what little they had, not just money, but food, tools, information. A full pantry became a secret. A steady job became something you didn't talk about out loud. Envy was dangerous now. Desperation made people listen too closely. I stopped carrying everything with me. I learned to divide, to stash, to lie gently when asked how I was doing. Managing, I'd say. The word covered a multitude of truths. The newspapers stopped pretending by then. And headlines screamed, but screaming didn't help. It only exhausted the reader. I watched men scan the pages and then fold them carefully, as if order in one small thing might restore order in everything else. It didn't. The real currency had changed. Food, warmth, silence, skills. The ability to endure hunger without advertising it. The ability to watch without being seen. Those were worth more than any bill I'd ever held. I see people today obsess over numbers on screens, convinced that digits equal security. I've lived in a world where numbers meant nothing and a single potato meant survival. The transition happens faster than anyone believes. Back then, we thought money disappearing would be dramatic. It wasn't. It was humiliating, because it forced us to admit that what we trusted most had no spine at all. Hunger doesn't arrive all at once. It introduces itself politely, like an inconvenience. A missed breakfast, a smaller dinner. You tell yourself it's good for you, that you've eaten enough in your life already. The body agrees at first. It adjusts, it quiets its complaints. Then, one morning, you wake up and realize you've been negotiating with an enemy that never intended to compromise. I remember the first full day without food. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was confusing. My hands shook when I tried to button my coat. I dropped things, simple things. My thoughts wandered and came back slower, like they were walking through mud. I kept checking the clock, convinced time had stalled. By the third day, hunger had a personality. It whispered when I tried to sleep. It sharpened smells until they became painful. And I could tell what people had eaten just by passing them on the street. Fat, salt, sugar. Each one announced itself like an insult. I dreamed of food constantly, but not feasts, not abundance, just plain things. Potatoes, bread crusts, a spoon scraping the bottom of a pot. The lines formed early. Before dawn, people gathered outside soup kitchens and churches, standing quietly, conserving energy. No one spoke unless necessary. Pride was heavy then. You could see it in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way hats were pulled low. These were not beggars in their own minds. They were citizens waiting for a delay to end. The soup was thin, always thin, more water than anything else. But it was hot, and that mattered. You learned to drink it slowly, to let the warmth spread before swallowing. I watched people tilt their bowls carefully, licking the last drops like children, then straighten themselves and pretend they hadn't. Hunger stripped people down. Temper shortened, patience vanished. Arguments flared over nothing and everything. I saw friendships end over a loaf of bread. I saw a man knocked unconscious for a sack of apples that turned out to be mostly rotten. Hunger made us animals, but not wild ones, cornered ones. Children changed fastest. Their faces lost softness first. Cheeks hollowed, eyes grew too large for their skulls. They stopped playing, stopped asking questions. They learned silence the way adults learn desperation. I still see them sometimes when I close my eyes, sitting on stoops, watching the world like it had personally betrayed them. My own body betrayed me. I grew weak in ways I hadn't known were possible. Climbing stairs felt like scaling cliffs. Cold seeped into my bones and stayed there. Cuts healed slowly, if at all. I learned to move less, speak less, think carefully before spending energy on anything that didn't lead directly to survival. Food became morality. People judged one another by what they ate and how they got it. Accusations flew quietly. Who had extra? Who was hiding something? Who had sold out? Who had stolen? Trust eroded faster than flesh. I did things I never thought I would. Nothing monstrous, nothing heroic, just small compromises that added up. I took more than my share once. I lied about how hungry I was another time. I looked away when someone needed help because I knew helping them might mean hurting myself later. Hunger doesn't make you evil. It makes you honest about how fragile your goodness is. Oh, the city smelled different then. not just of rot and waste, but of bodies burning themselves from the inside out. Kitchens cold, stoves unlit, smoke gone from the sky. Even sound changed. People spoke less. When they did, their voices carried a flatness, like emotion was too expensive to afford. I learned the true weight of a meal, not the taste, the cost. How many hours of waiting it took, what had to be traded or surrendered. Every bite carried a calculation. Every swallow was followed by the fear of when the next one would come. I hear people today talk about hunger like it's an inconvenience, like skipping a meal is a hardship worth announcing. They have never felt their body turn against them, never watched their thoughts narrow to a single need, never understood how close civilization lives to the edge of the plate. Back then, while hunger wasn't just a condition, it was a teacher, and its lessons were cruel, unforgettable, and permanent. By the time we realized it wasn't leaving soon, it had already rewritten who we were. Hunger didn't just take food, it took the masks. Before, people wore decency the way they wore coats, out of habit, because everyone else did. When things grew cold enough, those coats came off, not all at once, not in obvious ways, but piece by piece, until you could see who was dressed for comfort and who had never prepared for winter at all. At first, neighbors still greeted one another, still shared small courtesies. Doors remained unlocked in some buildings. People trusted familiarity. That trust didn't survive long. I remember a woman on my floor, kind once, always smiling. She knocked one evening, asking if I had extra matches. I gave her a few without thinking. The next night, my door was tried, quietly, carefully. Not a knock, a test. When I called out, whoever it was disappeared down the stairs without a sound. After that, I slept lighter. Thefts were small at first. A loaf missing, a coat gone from a hallway hook, shoes taken while someone slept. People accused strangers, then realized the truth was closer. The enemy was not outside the building. It was living next door. Arguments escalated quickly. A shove turned into a beating. A raised voice turned into a knife drawn too early. The rules we had lived by, don't hit, don't steal, don't betray, were replaced by new ones that weren't written down but were understood all the same. Protect what's yours. Show strength. Don't hesitate. I saw men I respected become dangerous, not cruel for the sake of it. Focused, narrow. Their kindness hadn't vanished. It had been rationed, saved for blood, for those they claimed as their own. Everyone else became an obstacle or a risk. I saw women learn to lie convincingly and to hide food where no one would look, to smile while calculating exits. Children learned to watch adults instead of trusting them. Families closed ranks, and anyone outside that circle became expendable. Churches filled at first, then emptied. Faith didn't disappear, but it changed shape. People prayed for different things. Not prosperity, not forgiveness, just one more day, one more meal, one more chance. When prayers went unanswered long enough, some people stopped praying altogether. Others prayed harder and became angry when nothing changed. Morality became conditional. Stealing was wrong unless it fed your children. Violence was unforgivable unless it prevented worse violence later. Lies were shameful unless the truth would get you killed. Each person redrew the line in a different place, and none of us agreed where it should be. And I crossed lines I never imagined crossing. I didn't think of it that way at the time. I told myself stories to survive the nights, that I was doing what was necessary, that I would make it right later. Hunger is very good at postponing accountability. I watched a man die over a sack of flour. It wasn't dramatic. No speech, no last words, just a fall, a sound like breath leaving a room, and then stillness. People stood around for a moment, uncertain what to do next. Then they dispersed, each carrying the lesson in silence. After that, people stopped pretending. We learned to assess one another quickly. Who looked weak? Who looked desperate? Who looked armed? Eye contact became dangerous. Friendliness became suspicious. You didn't ask how someone was doing unless you were prepared to hear the truth or lie in response. The city didn't fall into chaos the way stories like to tell it. It hardened, like mud drying in the sun, cracking slowly, quietly, permanently. I see that hardening beginning today, not in crimes or riots, but in how quickly people turn on one another, how fast empathy drains when resources feel threatened, how easily neighbors become competitors. Back then, we learned something painful and useful. Civilization isn't held together by laws. It's held together by surplus. When the surplus disappears, so does the performance. What remains is who people really are, and how far they're willing to go to stay alive. By the time we reached that understanding, the damage was already done, and there was no unlearning it. Hope arrived in uniforms. That's how it always does. Pressed, organized, carrying clipboards and promises. By the time the government truly appeared in our streets, we were already thinner, quieter, more dangerous than the people they thought they were helping. At first, the announcements felt reassuring. Notices posted on walls, men speaking from trucks, words like relief, assistance, programs. They sounded solid, structured, like the old world trying to remember itself out loud. We lined up again. We were good at lining up by then. The lines were longer than the food lines had ever been. They wrapped around buildings and down streets, filled with people clutching papers, numbers, proof of need. The air buzzed with a strange mixture of gratitude and resentment. Gratitude that someone had noticed, resentment that it had taken this long, and help moved slowly. Forms needed to be filled, eligibility determined, rules explained by men who went home to full meals. Some people were turned away because their need didn't fit the shape required. Others waited all day only to be told to come back tomorrow. Tomorrow became another word that lost its meaning. I watched people weaken while waiting to be approved for survival. Some relief came. I won't pretend otherwise. Soup kitchens expanded, work programs appeared, hard labor for modest food and a few coins that still barely bought anything. I swung a shovel alongside men who used to run offices, our hands blistering the same way, our pride buried beneath dirt and exhaustion. The work mattered, but it didn't fix the core problem. The scale was wrong. There were too many of us, and too little to go around. And too much paperwork between hunger and relief. Too much faith in process when urgency was what was required. Systems moved at the speed they were designed for. Peace. Hunger moved faster. I saw men break under the weight of waiting. Not screaming, not protesting, just folding inward, sitting down in lines and refusing to stand again, staring ahead as if the answer might appear if they looked long enough. Some never went home. They simply faded out of the routine, absorbed into alleyways and doorways where no forms were required. The government tried to restore order. Order without trust is just choreography. Rules were enforced unevenly. Favoritism crept in quietly. Information became a currency of its own, knowing where to line up, who to talk to, which days to show up early. And those who adapted survived better than those who waited patiently. I learned something then that I have never forgotten. No institution can care about you the way you care about yourself. That's not cruelty. It's physics. Governments are built to manage populations, not individuals. When systems strain, they protect themselves first. That doesn't make them evil. It makes them predictable. The mistake is believing predictability equals protection. Some people waited for rescue. They trusted the announcements, the timelines, the assurances that things would stabilize if everyone just followed instructions. I watched them grow weaker week by week, their faith intact long after their bodies weren't. Others adjusted. They used relief when it came, but they didn't depend on it. They learned to supplement, to trade, and to work quietly outside the official channels. They didn't reject help. They just didn't bet their lives on it. I stood between those groups for a long time, too proud to fully depend, too cautious to fully abandon the system. That hesitation cost me more than hunger ever did. Energy wasted on hope that wasn't actionable is energy you don't get back. I hear the same faith today, that someone will step in, that plans exist, that delays are temporary, that institutions built for stability will perform perfectly under strain. I've seen how that story ends. Help is real, but it is never enough, never fast enough, and never evenly distributed. Those who survived didn't wait for permission to endure. They learned the rules, then learned how to live in the space between them. By the time order finally began to resemble something familiar again, the lesson had already been burned into us. You can accept help, but you cannot outsource survival, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never been truly hungry. Survival stopped being about strength long before it became about skill. The biggest men fell first, the loud ones, the ones who believed force could replace foresight. Endurance wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It worked quietly, methodically, like someone repairing a roof in the rain without telling anyone they were doing it. I learned fast, or I didn't learn at all. My job title became useless, but my hands still worked. That mattered. I could fix things, hinges, tools, small machines that had outlived the money used to buy them. Broken objects were everywhere. Replacement parts were not. People needed things to last longer than they were ever meant to. I traded repairs for food, not generously, fairly. Fairness mattered then. It built reputation. Reputation fed you when money couldn't, and I learned when to speak and when to disappear. Information was as valuable as bread, but only if you knew how to hold it. Talkative men were remembered. Remembered men were watched. Watched men were targeted. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to let others fill silences while I studied faces. Silence kept me alive more than once. I learned to eat without celebration. No savoring, no gratitude spoken aloud. Just fuel consumed efficiently. You didn't let others see joy in eating. It invited questions. You didn't let others see despair either. It invited pity or worse. Neutrality became armor. I learned to move with purpose. Wandering wasted calories. Standing around wasted time. Every step had a reason. Every errand connected to another. I planned routes that passed opportunities, scrap, rumors. Now warmth. without advertising that I was looking for any of it. I learned restraint, not just with food, but with emotion. Anger burned energy, fear clouded judgment. Panic was contagious and useless. The people who survived longest were not the bravest or the strongest. They were the calmest. They let others rush ahead and watched what happened. I learned the value of useless things. A bent nail, a cracked cup, a scrap of wire. Anything could be repurposed. Nothing was truly trash until you had nothing left. The habit of throwing things away died quickly. Scarcity rewired the mind. I learned to share selectively. Total isolation killed people. Total generosity did too. Survival lived in the narrow space between. I formed quiet alliances. 2 men watching each other's backs, and 3 families sharing information without sharing everything. Trust was built slowly and tested constantly. I learned that preparation was invisible. The men who talked about stockpiles didn't last. The ones who had them never mentioned it. Security came from being underestimated, looking ordinary, slightly tired, never threatening, never impressive. I see people today mistake confidence for readiness. They buy things without learning how to use them. They collect tools without skills. They talk about survival as if it were an aesthetic. Back then, survival was dull, repetitive, unromantic. It was waking up and doing the same careful things every day without applause. The most important skill I learned wasn't mechanical or physical. It was judgment, knowing when to walk away, when to wait, when to trade, when to lie, and when to tell the truth, because the truth would be cheaper in the long run. Hunger teaches you that bad decisions are more expensive than empty stomachs. I didn't survive because I was special. I survived because I adapted faster than my pride. By the time the world began stitching itself back together, the men who endured weren't the ones who had planned for everything. They were the ones who had learned to learn while everything was falling apart. And that lesson has never stopped being useful. Rebuilding didn't feel like victory. There were no celebrations, no clean lines between before and after, just a slow, uneven return of things that resembled the old world, but carried scars if you looked closely enough. The first sign wasn't money, it was noise. Hammers again, radios playing faint music through open windows. The sound of argument that wasn't desperate, just annoyed. People complaining about small things with real energy behind it. That's when I knew something had shifted. When irritation returned, it meant survival was no longer the only job. Work came back in fragments, short contracts, temporary jobs that kept food on the table but didn't restore confidence. Men worked harder than they ever had and still felt behind. We had learned not to trust stability, so even when it appeared, we treated it like a guest who might leave without saying goodbye. Money returned, but it felt different in the hand. Lighter, less honest. We used it again, but we didn't believe in it the way we once had. We remembered what happened when belief vanished. Some people saved obsessively, others spent recklessly, convinced tomorrow was a myth. Both behaviors came from the same wound. Families didn't always come back together. Some bonds had been broken too cleanly, too finally. You can't always undo what hunger reveals. I saw men who survived alone because they had pushed everyone else away. I saw families who stayed together by never speaking of what had been done to survive. Silence became a foundation. The city rebuilt its face before its soul. Buildings were repaired, shops reopened, systems resumed. But underneath, People had changed, and we watched each other more closely. We trusted slower. We kept quiet reserves of food, of money, of knowledge, long after it was considered unnecessary. Memory faded faster than wisdom. Newspapers stopped mentioning the worst years. Children grew up hearing fragments softened by time. People wanted to move forward, not look back. The lessons became uncomfortable. They challenged the comforting idea that collapse was impossible, that suffering was an exception instead of a feature. I carried the knowledge alone for a long time, not because I wanted to, but because no one asked. Warnings sound like insults to those who feel safe. I learned to keep my mouth shut and my eyes open. I learned to live two lives, the visible one that fit the new normal, and the quiet one that never forgot how quickly normal disappears. And I see the same rebuilding energy today, the same confidence returning too fast, the same impatience with caution. People want assurance, not history. They want guarantees, not reminders. They rebuild the surface and assume the foundation will take care of itself. It won't. Rebuilding is not proof of resilience. It's proof of opportunity. What matters is what people remember when things are good again, and how quickly they forget when they are. I never forgot the sound of silence outside locked banks. I never forgot the way hunger rearranged morality. I never forgot how quickly neighbors became threats and how slowly trust returned. I didn't plan to speak. People like me learn early that memory is a burden no one volunteers to carry. We keep quiet because silence is easier than argument, and because warning others often sounds like arrogance when things are still working. No one wants to be told the ground beneath them is thinner than it looks. But I have lived long enough to recognize a pattern. I hear it in the language people use now, the casual faith in systems they don't understand, the irritation when something doesn't arrive on time, the anger at inconvenience dressed up as injustice. These are not signs of collapse, but they are the same sounds that came before it. Back then, we believed complexity was strength, that because something was interconnected, it must be resilient. We mistook motion for stability, activity for security. We didn't realize that tightly coupled things don't bend well. They snap. I see people today counting on promises instead of capacities, counting on access instead of possession, counting on rescue instead of readiness. They assume tomorrow will correct today because it always has for them. So did we. The warning is not that disaster is guaranteed. The warning is that comfort erodes memory, and memory is the only real defense against repeating history. When people stop remembering how bad things can get, they start arranging their lives in ways that only work when everything functions perfectly. Nothing functions perfectly for long. I am not telling you to panic. Panic is wasteful. Panic makes noise. Panic advertises weakness. I am telling you to notice. Notice how dependent you are on things you don't control. Notice how few skills you possess that work without permission. Notice how quickly people turn cruel when pressure enters the room. None of that makes humanity evil. It makes it predictable. I survived because I learned early that survival is personal. No system will ever love you back. No institution will ever bleed for you. Help may come, but it will never arrive before the need. The distance between those two moments is where people disappear. I am speaking now because I recognize the calm before the question, not the calm before the storm. Storms pass. The calm before people ask, how did this happen? By then, it's too late to listen. If you take anything from this, let it be small and actionable. Learn something real with your hands. Reduce your dependence quietly. Build margins where you can. And store humility alongside whatever you store for emergencies. Pay attention to how things fail, not how they succeed. History does not repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself politely, until politeness is no longer necessary. I starved once in a world that believed itself modern, advanced, protected. We thought we were smarter than those who came before us. We weren't, and neither are you, unless you remember. That is why I'm speaking now, not to scare you, to remind you what silence sounds like before it comes back.